Hey guys, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching his year Clodius by Historia Civilis. So where we last left off was Caesar's continued conquests in Gaul. He defeated Ariovistus and his forces. And now we are returning, I think, to Rome perhaps. I'm not actually sure who Clodius is. The name sounds familiar, but I really don't know. So this one's sort of a mystery to me, so let's see what we're about to get into. Let's jump into it.
Publius Clodius Pulcher was one of the tribunes of the plebs in 58 BCE, and we're going to talk about what he did during his year, but first we have to set the stage a bit.
It's kind of interesting that he's getting a year. I mean, he's the tribune of the plebs. Usually these things are reserved for consuls, or Cato got one, but he was a sort of a prominent politician, but maybe Clodius was too. Let's see.
Before 58, Clodius had been a minor player in the Reform faction. He was around for some of the events that we've talked about already. Clodius, or Claudius as he was known at this time, served as one of Cicero's bodyguards during the Catiline conspiracy in 63 BCE. Then, at the end of Cato's year as tribune of the plebs in 62, Claudius was caught in a sex scandal. Here's the short version. A religious ceremony was being held in Julius Caesar's home. This particular ceremony was being performed by women, so Caesar was gone and his wife Pompeia was leading it. For some stupid reason, Claudius dressed up as a woman and snuck into the ceremony, intent on seducing Caesar's wife.
What? Why? What? I don't know if this is necessarily a true story, but this is ridiculous. Just why would you do that?
He was discovered, obviously. As you can imagine, this was a juicy scandal, and it would become the obsession of the political class. Caesar would end up divorcing his wife over this incident.
Wow.
Claudius was put on trial for committing a sacrilege, and what followed became the trial of the century. Improbably, Caesar ended up as one of Claudius's most vocal supporters. This seems weird to us, and it seemed weird to people at the time, but these men were both reformers, and apparently Caesar was more interested in supporting his political ally than his own wife.
You know what? I mean, it is a little shocking, but it doesn't necessarily surprise me about Caesar. You know, we talked about it before. Caesar was willing to do anything to forward his ambitions in his career. I mean, we talked about how he was willing to give up a triumph in order to run for consul. You know, a triumph was a great military parade given to conquering heroes. It was one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest honor you could win as a Roman. Caesar was willing to give that up in order to run for consul and further his career. So, I mean, obviously it's an odd situation that Caesar would side with Claudius here, given what he had done. But if Caesar thinks this is going to, forward his career somehow, it's not entirely surprising that he would side with Claudius. Caesar would put his ambitions above all else.
Claudius's whole defense was that he wasn't even in Rome on the day in question. Cicero was the only person willing to testify that that wasn't true. Claudius saw this as a betrayal, and he wouldn't forget it. Against all odds, Claudius was acquitted. Word is that both judge and jury benefited from huge bribes from prominent reformers. The ruling was just as scandalous as the crime itself. Anyway, let's jump ahead. Claudius would go on to be elected quaestor, and would receive a lifetime appointment to the Senate as a result. During Caesar's year in 59, Claudius got it into his head that he wanted to run for tribune of the plebs. Why? Here's my theory. The system for electing praetors and consuls was heavily weighted towards the rich and powerful. These people hated Claudius's guts from the whole sex scandal thing. He was still a few years away from being eligible for praetor, but he needed to beef up his resume if he wanted to stand a chance. Plus, we shouldn't overlook the fact that Caesar's election in 59 was a big turning point for the Reform faction. They had been in the political wilderness ever since the Catiline conspiracy, and Claudius was eager to be part of Caesar's new populist wave. But
that's someone with a bit of political savvy, if that's his reasoning. The Reform faction was coming to power. There was a lot of popularity associated with them in the figure of Caesar. So, perhaps Claudius saw that and wanted to jump on that bandwagon. Or, perhaps he was, legitimately a believer. Or, he wanted to further his career without having to deal with the wealthy Romans that hated him.
But there was one catch. Claudius was part of an old patrician family and was therefore ineligible to run for tribune of the plebs. The hint is in the name. The tribune actually had to be a plebeian. So with the help of Caesar and Pompey, Claudius came up with a scheme to get around this restriction. He renounced his patrician status and was adopted into some random plebeian family, with Caesar as Rome's head priest conducting the adoption ceremony.
I think I've heard of this. I've definitely heard of this, Claudius becoming a plebeian. So this is starting to ring a bell.
The whole thing was a farce. His new adoptive father was younger than he was. To show off his new plebeian status, Claudius changed his name to Clodius, and immediately threw his hat in the ring to become one of next year's tribunes of the plebs. He won. I've mentioned this before, but tribunes of the plebs started their terms in December, so he got to overlap a little bit with Caesar's term as consul. The first notable thing he did, and we can now recognize the full importance of this act, was to veto Bibulus' final speech on his last day as consul. Clodius wanted to align himself publicly with Caesar, and humiliating Bibulus was a great way to do just that.
Yep.
Clodius came in with a full slate of populist reforms he wanted to pass, very ambitious for a tribune of the plebs. First, he proposed a bill that made the grain dole not just heavily subsidized, but 100% free for all qualifying Romans. You can just imagine how this drove the conservatives crazy. Cato had radically expanded the grain dole in an attempt to mollify the reformers. I guess it didn't work. After Cato and Clodius expanded and deepened the grain dole, it took up a significant portion of Rome's annual budget. Cicero raised objections to the high cost of this bill, just like he did last time with Cato. But with two reformers as consuls, Cicero didn't have enough support to halt the momentum of the populists.
Wow.
The bill passed.
That's really interesting. So, I remember when we talked about the conservatives in Cato, what they did was expand the grain dole in order to, take one of the populist main issues away from them. This is sort of a common and pretty smart political tactic. If your opponent is advocating for something, you just do it instead, and then they don't have a leg to stand on. Conservative politicians have often used this to combat progressives and reformers. They take some of their issues and they implement them to a certain extent to stop the reformers from getting into power. In this case, I guess it didn't work. Sometimes it does work. In this case, it didn't. The reformers wanted to keep going, and I suppose they had the support to keep going, as we've seen from this bill passing.
Clodius then introduced the bill, further aligning himself with Caesar. The bill would take away the consul's ability to shut down public business over bad omens. This was one of the tools that Bibulus had used when he attempted to undermine Caesar's year as consul.
I mean, yeah, now that it worked, Bibulus used, a couple of tricks from within the confines of his home to try and limit what Caesar could do, and Caesar ignored every one of them. So, Bibulus's tactics had no effect anyway.
With this bill, the message was clear. The reformers intended to have electoral success going forward, and these little procedural tricks weren't going to fly anymore. What Bibulus did was still very unpopular with the public, so the bill passed easily.
Yeah.
Cato had made Caesar's life a living hell during his year, and Clodius wanted to eliminate him as a potential threat. His plan was a little complicated, but here it goes. Clodius argued that in the east, the island of Cyprus, which was an autonomous region under Egypt's influence, rightfully belonged to Rome. Remember, Egypt had been left in a will to the Roman Republic, and Rome hadn't really done anything about it. So Caesar had settled the issue by accepting huge bribes and renouncing Rome's claim. Clodius introduced legislation arguing that this deal didn't extend to Cyprus, since it wasn't technically part of Egypt. Was Clodius right? In a strictly legal sense, maybe, but it seems clear to me that the spirit of Caesar's deal with Ptolemy was that Rome would leave Egypt alone. After only a year, Rome was beginning to chip away at that agreement.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, it's Rome. So, if you're an ally of Rome's and you make an agreement with them, there's a good chance that they will eventually chip away at your territory. Rome is an ever-expanding entity. It was very difficult to keep them constrained, even through allyship. So it's not entirely surprising.
After that bill was passed, he followed it up with another one, saying that Cato should officially oversee Rome's annexation of Cyprus. This was just a ploy to get Cato out of the way, by sending him overseas to do a job that any nameless bureaucrat could do. But Cato felt honor-bound to obey the will of the Senate, so he went.
I mean, that's pretty amazing. Clodius is getting a lot done, and this is all in the span of a year. Pretty impressive, the amount he's achieving. He's just managed to get rid of one of the most prominent and vocal conservatives, ship him off to a dead-end job somewhere else. That's got to be a pretty big victory for the reformers. I mean, Cato is one of the most prominent conservatives, one of their, most prominent and influential voices, and Clodius has managed to get him out of the picture, at least for a certain amount of time.
Clodius was a busy lad, but it was all building to a purpose. He introduced another piece of legislation, taking away the provinces that had been assigned to the sitting consuls, and giving them more prestigious and wealthy ones instead. Clodius was doing two things here. He was signaling to the reformers that we take care of our own, and he was basically bribing the consuls for what would come next. Now the stage was set. All of Clodius's machinations so far were building to this. He introduced a bill that would make it retroactively illegal for any public official to execute any citizen without trial. Key word, retroactively. There was no mistaking who this bill was targeting. The only living person it applied to was Cicero.
So, these situations, like I said, Clodius ringing some bells now. So, I remember when we did Cicero's year and we talked about his execution of the Catiline conspirators, with no trial. Just a straight-up execution. Caesar had protested that, and it was quite popular at the time, but I mentioned that, it would be controversial down the line, and we are sort of seeing that come to fruition here. Obviously, it's pretty ironic that Caesar would protest that when, Caesar was not one for obeying the rule of law, but the point still stands that, Cicero's actions on that occasion would come to, be controversial down the line. And so we're going to see how that turns out here.
Who had executed the ringleaders of the Catiline conspiracy in his year. He had done so with the approval of the Senate, but it didn't matter. This bill would make it illegal anyway. The two sitting consuls, being sympathetic reformers and sufficiently bribed, backed the bill. It's a testament to the strong populist energy in the air that Cicero's personal popularity in the Senate wasn't enough to stop this from happening. The bill passed. Finally, Clodius would have his revenge. He officially charged Cicero for the executions of the prisoners during the Catiline conspiracy. When they went to trial, Clodius seemed to be getting a lot of support from the people. At times, the audience in attendance could get pretty rowdy.
Oh yeah, Roman trials were quite a show. Roman lawyers were kind of superstars. They would put on a performance for the audience, and it was participatory to a certain extent. The audience would yell, they would scream, they would, clap, whatever. The courthouse was not a quiet place. Roman trials were, kind of a form of entertainment. And like I said, a way for politicians to build reputation by performing to the crowds.
And at the end of each day when Cicero would walk home, a group would follow him, shouting insults and pelting him with stones.
Jeez.
Cicero began to fear for his life.
Yeah.
After several days of this, he made the difficult decision to flee the city. Clodius jumped all over this. As soon as he found out, he introduced another bill formally banishing Cicero and seizing all of his property. The trial showed how much influence Clodius was gaining out on the streets, and the Senate didn't have the courage to stand up against him. The bill passed, and Cicero would spend the next year of his life in exile.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with Cicero putting those men to death without a trial. Due process would have been nice, but, you can understand his actions were taken to protect the Republic, and I can't blame him for fleeing the city. I would also feel like my life was at risk. On another hand, Clodius, I couldn't even remember who this guy was before watching this video. I was somewhat familiar with him, but look at the amount of influence he's managed to amass. The Senate can hardly oppose the bills that he puts forward due to the mass public support, and he's managed to knock off two of, the most important senators, Cato, one of the main conservative voices, and Cicero, who, Cicero always did his own thing, but he was kind of a moderate conservative, sort of an independent fellow, but more leaning towards the conservative side of things. Cato has managed to remove them from Roman political life. Not permanently, they'll come back, but, that shows you the power that Clodius has managed to amass. It's pretty remarkable, honestly.
Like the rest of the Senate, Pompey had stayed quiet during the debate to banish Cicero, but Pompey liked Cicero, and more importantly, he liked his politics. He began working behind the scenes to gather the support from other senators to overturn Cicero's banishment.
Like I said, Cicero, he leaned conservative, but he was an independent guy. Cicero had a lot of friends in many different wings of politics. He was a generally well-respected guy. So, Cato was a blatant partisan, so it's kind of like the reformers, no love lost there. But Cicero was pretty widely respected, so, it's remarkable that Clodius even managed to get him, basically exiled from the city. But, we're seeing sort of some of his allies gather to try and help.
Clodius caught wind of this and ordered his growing gang out on the street to focus their attention on Pompey.
Wow.
They gave him the same treatment they gave Cicero, and it got so bad that Pompey didn't feel safe leaving his home.
So, this... I've talked about how several times, and this is one of the reasons why I like the late Republican period so much. It's really an interesting period. The level of violence we've seen throughout these videos, like mob violence and political violence, is a really bad sign for any democracy or republic, whatever you want to call it. If you're seeing this sort of political violence and people are seeing it as legitimate, your republic is on the way out. It's probably not doing so well. This is also crazy because, Pompey is part of the triumvirate. He's a close ally of Caesar's. So Clodius is really sort of, I would say overstepping his bounds, but he's really showing that he has a lot of power here and he's going to do what he wants to do. I'm not sure if we'll get Caesar's perspective on this, but I'm not too sure Caesar would have been entirely happy with this, given that Pompey was a close political ally, at least at this point. Or maybe that's not true. Maybe the alliance wasn't as strong at this point. I'm not sure. But you're definitely seeing the power that Clodius yields, mainly from popular support and sort of mob violence, which is being legitimized at this point.
They may not have realized it at the time, but Clodius had effectively seized control of the government. Rome's politics were broken.
Yeah.
But Clodius's opponents had one more trick up their sleeve, and it's the oldest political trick in the book. They just decided to buckle down and wait him out. 8 of the 10 tribunes of the plebs joined forces and blocked all significant legislation from everybody. Pompey and other senators started lobbying next year's consuls to overturn Cicero's banishment after Clodius was out of office. It would take months and months of hard work, but in time, the Senate would get Cicero home. Clodius's year may have ended with gridlock, but he would go down as the most consequential tribune of the plebs in more than 60 years. And in the years to follow, his influence would only grow.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if he's going to pop up again. That was fascinating. Now I see why Clodius got one of these his year videos. His influence was remarkable. That was a really interesting one. I'm excited to continue watching more Historia Civilis videos. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon, and please check out my new video on Diderot on my main channel. It's linked down below. Anyway, I will see you guys again with the next reaction. I hope you guys are all having a good day. Goodbye.